For years, Savannah Guthrie was the one asking the hard questions. Politicians? Cornered. CEOs? Exposed. Powerful figures? Uncomfortable. But here's the twist no one saw coming. What happens when the person who demands the truth suddenly becomes surrounded by silence? Because right now, something feels off. Not loud, not explosive, just wrong. An investigation that was quietly building momentum, documents collected, names connected, timelines mapped, and then, out of nowhere, it just stopped. No warning, no explanation, no conclusion, just silence. And buried inside that silence, a name starts circulating. Not trending, not confirmed, but impossible to ignore. Michael Feldman, a man who was never supposed to be the news. A strategist, a fixer, someone who operates behind closed doors. Where influence isn't seen, it's felt. So now the question isn't what happened, it's why did it suddenly stop? Was there nothing there? Or did something get too close to people who were never meant to be questioned? Because when power protects itself, the truth doesn't disappear. It gets buried. The moment a news stops making noise is usually the moment it starts getting dangerous. Because loud scandals? They burn fast. They trend. They fade. But this one didn't explode. It slowed down. And that's exactly what makes it different. Because in a city like Washington, D.C., nothing important just slows down without a reason. Nothing. Especially not an investigation that was already moving, already building, already connecting dots that weren't supposed to connect. At first, it didn't even have a name attached to it. Just a quiet review. A routine sweep into foreign influence activity tied to major consulting firms. The kind of thing that happens all the time and usually leads nowhere interesting. Until it does. Because behind the polished glass offices and carefully written statements, firms like Glover Park Group don't just advise. They influence. They shape narratives. They open doors that don't open for everyone. And in that world, access is everything. The right call, the right meeting, the right introduction at the right time. Those, not in public, not on camera,
but in rooms you'll never see.
Was one of the people who, not loud, not flashy, but precise, calculated. The kind of person who doesn't need attention because he already has influence. He wasn't the face. He was the strategy behind the face. The voice behind the voice. And that's exactly why his name showing up, even quietly, changes everything. Because people like Michael Feldman aren't supposed to be visible. They're supposed to stay in the background. So when they don't, you start asking why. Now officially, this wasn't about him. Not at the beginning. The investigation was broader. Messier. Focused on a network of firms working across international clients, some corporate, some political, some hard to define. The kind of clients that operate in gray areas. Not illegal, but not entirely comfortable either. And that's where things start to blur. Because when influence crosses borders, rules don't just get complicated. They get flexible. There's paperwork, disclosures, filings, all part of something called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. On paper, it's simple. If you represent foreign interests, you declare it. You disclose everything.
Clean.
Transparent. Accountable. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. But in reality is rarely that clean. Because the system doesn't just run on laws. It runs on interpretation. And interpretation can be stretched.
Carefully. Strategically.
Legally. Until what's required and what's actually revealed aren't always the same thing. That's not an accusation. That's the system. And Michael Feldman built his career inside that system. Learning it, mastering it, navigating it in ways most people don't even understand. So when investigators started mapping connections, tracing timelines, following communication trails between firms and foreign-linked entities, they weren't looking for a headline. They were looking for patterns. Consistency, or the lack of it. And for a while, that's exactly what they were finding. Nothing explosive, nothing headline-worthy, just details. Small ones, repeated ones, the kind that don't seem important until they start forming a bigger picture. A meeting here, a contract there, a delayed disclosure, a name appearing slightly outside the expected timeline. Individually, harmless.
Together?
Uncomfortable. And somewhere inside those overlapping layers, Glover Park Group kept appearing. Not front and center, but present, consistent, close enough to raise questions, far enough to avoid answers. And that's when Michael Feldman's name started circulating. Not officially, not publicly, but internally. Quiet conversations, follow-up requests, additional document reviews. The kind of attention that doesn't make headlines but absolutely changes direction. Because once a name like that enters the conversation, everything slows down. Every step becomes more careful, more deliberate, more cautious. And at first that made sense. This wasn't a small player. This wasn't a random consultant. This was someone connected, deeply connected, across industries, across influence circles, across networks that don't just disappear when questioned. So investigators did what they always do. They kept digging. More documents, more interviews, more cross-checking.
Piece by piece.
Layer by layer. Building something that wasn't off but wasn't random either. And then something shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but noticeably. The urgency faded. Follow-up slowed. Requests that should have been immediate weren't. People who expected a second interview never got the call. And that's when it stopped feeling like a process and started feeling like a pause. A very specific kind of pause. The kind that doesn't come from lack of evidence, but from too much complexity. Because when a case starts touching too many sensitive points, legal, political, financial, it doesn't always collapse. Sometimes it just stops moving. And in Washington, D.C., that kind of silence, it doesn't go unnoticed. People talk, quietly,
Carefully.
behind closed doors. And the conversation isn't about what's proven. It's about what's possible, what might have been uncovered, what might have been too close to something bigger. Because here's the thing no one says out loud. Investigations don't always end because they're finished. Sometimes they end because continuing them becomes complicated. And Michael Feldman? He exists right at the center of that kind of complication. A man who understands influence, who understands timing, who understands exactly how far something can go before it goes too far. And standing just outside that world is Savannah Guthrie, a journalist who built her entire career on one principle: ask the questions no one else is willing to ask. Which makes this moment uncomfortable, because now the question isn't just out there in the world, it's closer, much closer. And the deeper you look into this news, the clearer one thing becomes: this was never just about an investigation. It's about access, influence, and what happens when the two collide in ways that aren't supposed to be visible. Because the news didn't explode, it didn't collapse, it didn't resolve, it just stopped. And in a system built on movement, that might be the loudest signal of all. And this is where the news stops feeling like a slow mystery and starts feeling like something much bigger. Because once the movement faded, something else took its place. Patterns. Not loud, not obvious, but consistent enough to raise eyebrows in rooms where people are trained not to react. According to internal whispers, never confirmed, never denied, there were documents that didn't quite line up the way they were supposed to. Timelines that overlapped in ways that felt inconvenient. Meetings that were officially logged but only partially explained. And relationships that, on paper, looked standard, until someone started asking how often they actually occurred behind the scenes. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because in the world Michael Feldman operates in, nothing is ever just a coincidence. Every call has a purpose. Every introduction has a strategy. Every delay? Intentional. So when certain disclosures under Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, appeared late, not missing, not hidden, just slightly delayed, it didn't trigger alarms publicly. But internally, it triggered questions. Why the delay? Who approved it? And more importantly, what was happening during the gap? That gap became the focus. Not a scandal, not a smoking gun, but a window. A very specific window where influence could exist without being fully visible. And that's when investigators, at least the ones still quietly engaged, started looking deeper into financial flows. Not illegal transactions. Nothing that would headline a news broadcast. but layered movements, consulting fees, advisory retainers, international partnerships that looked clean on the surface but stretched across multiple jurisdictions. The kind of structure that isn't designed to hide anything illegal but is definitely designed to make things harder to trace. And once you start tracing, you start noticing something else. Consistency. The same names appearing across different projects. The same intermediaries showing up in multiple deals. The same patterns repeating just enough to suggest coordination but never enough to prove it outright. And right there, right at that intersection, Glover Park Group kept showing up again. Not as the center, never the center, but always close. Close enough to be relevant. Far enough to stay protected. And inside those layers, Michael Feldman wasn't just a name anymore. He was a connector. A point of alignment between conversations that weren't supposed to overlap. Between clients that weren't supposed to be linked, between timelines that, on paper, should have stayed separate. And that's when the whispers turned into something else. Speculation. Careful. Controlled. But spreading. Because when patterns start repeating in a system built on precision, people notice. Even if they don't say it out loud. Now, publicly, none of this existed. No reports. No official statements. No accusations. But behind closed doors, different news. Sources, anonymous, of course, began describing an environment where the investigation hadn't ended, it had just become sensitive. Too sensitive. One insider allegedly put it like this: "It's not about what you can prove. It's about what you're willing to pursue." And that changes everything. Because suddenly the question isn't, is there a case? It's, how far can this go before it hits something untouchable? And that's where public reaction starts to split. On one side, people who believe this is nothing. A routine review. Complicated, yes, but ultimately clean. No wrongdoing. No news. Just noise being misinterpreted as something bigger. But on the other side, a very different narrative starts forming. Online forums. Private discussions. Even subtle commentary from analysts who choose their words very carefully. They're not saying something happened. They're saying something doesn't feel finished. And that difference, that gap between nothing happened and we don't have all the answers, that's where controversy lives. Because people don't react to certainty. They react to doubt. And this news is built entirely on doubt. Then come the lifestyle questions. Not accusations. Just observations. Because when someone operates at Michael Feldman's level, people start looking at everything. Travel patterns. High-level meetings in cities that don't always appear on official schedules. Private events where guest lists are never fully disclosed. Luxury settings where conversations happen off the record. Again, none of this is unusual. Not in his world. But when you place it next to an investigation that suddenly slows down, it starts to feel different. More connected. More intentional. And that's when the narrative shifts from what happened to who benefits from nothing happening. Because make no mistake, when an investigation stalls, someone benefits. Maybe it's because there's nothing there. Or maybe it's because whatever is there isn't easy to confront. And this is where Savannah Guthrie's presence adds another layer that no one can ignore. Because she represents the exact opposite of all this. Clarity. Transparency. Accountability. The person who pushes for answers, now standing right next to a situation filled with questions. And she says nothing. Not a statement. Not a denial. Not even a carefully worded response. Just silence. Controlled. Intentional. Disciplined silence. And that silence? It's doing exactly what silence always does. It's making people wonder. Because in a world where narratives are controlled, silence is never empty. It's strategic. And whether that strategy is about protection or patience is something no one can confirm. But everyone is thinking about. Meanwhile, the investigation officially remains exactly where it was. Not closed. Not active. Just there. Floating in a space that doesn't demand answers, but doesn't provide them either. And that's what makes this phase of the news so powerful. Because it's no longer about facts. It's about perception. And perception doesn't need proof. It just needs enough uncertainty to keep people watching, to keep people questioning, to keep the news alive without ever fully exposing it. Because the truth here, it's not hidden. It's just out of reach. And this is the point where stories like this usually explode. But this one doesn't. It tightens. Because the closer you get to the center of it, the less clear everything becomes. No arrests. No official statements. No dramatic press conferences. Just a growing pressure that never fully releases. And that's not accidental. Because in Washington, D.C., when something truly sensitive is unfolding, it doesn't always get louder. It gets quieter, more controlled, more contained, almost like the system itself is holding its breath. Behind the scenes, conversations didn't stop. They shifted. From open inquiries to closed-door discussions. From active investigation to careful observation. Because once a situation reaches a certain level of complexity, legal, political, financial, all intersecting, the question isn't just what is true, it becomes, what happens if we keep going? And that's where things start to change. Because continuing means risk. Not just for one person, but for networks, for institutions, for people connected in ways that aren't immediately visible. And Michael Feldman? He doesn't exist in isolation. He's part of a system, a network built over years, connections layered on connections, people who owe favors, people who return them, people who prefer certain things stay exactly where they are. So when his name becomes even loosely associated with something unresolved, it doesn't just create questions. It creates hesitation. And hesitation is powerful because it slows everything down without ever officially stopping it. Now here's where the news takes its most uncomfortable turn, because the longer this remains unresolved, the more it starts affecting things that aren't even directly connected. Clients begin to distance themselves, quietly. Not publicly. Never publicly. But meetings get postponed. Contracts get reviewed. New opportunities suddenly require more time. Not because of proven facts, but because of perception. And perception, in this world, can be more damaging than reality. Financial pressure doesn't hit all at once. It builds. Slowly. Legal teams get involved, not to defend something specific, but to prepare for anything. Statements are drafted and then never released. Strategies are created for scenarios that may never happen, because uncertainty forces preparation. And preparation is expensive. Time, money, reputation, all slowly being pulled into a situation that no one can clearly define. And still, no answers. Which brings everything back to one question. Why? Why does an investigation move forward with precision and then suddenly lose momentum? Why do follow-ups disappear? Why do people who expected scrutiny never hear from anyone again? There are explanations. Of course there are. There's always a version of the news that sounds clean, that says nothing was found, that everything checked out, that the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. And maybe that version is true. But here's the problem. That version hasn't been fully said either. There's no closure, no finality, just absence. And absence doesn't resolve a news. It extends it, because when something ends clearly, people move on. But when it doesn't, it lingers. And this news has lingered longer than most, quietly moving through Washington, D.C.'s most influential spaces, government offices, media circles, private gatherings where conversations don't get recorded, but definitely get remembered. And in those spaces, the narrative isn't fixed. It shifts depending on who's speaking. Some say it's overblown. Others say it barely scratched the surface. And then there are those who don't say anything at all, which in itself says a lot. Because silence at that level, it's rarely accidental. Meanwhile, Savannah Guthrie continues exactly as she always has. On screen, composed, focused, asking the same sharp questions, holding the same steady presence. If anything has changed, it's not visible. And that might be the most fascinating part of all. Because maintaining normalcy in the middle of uncertainty takes control, extreme control, the kind of discipline that doesn't just happen. It's chosen, every single day. But even that control has limits. Because while the public image remains intact, the private reality is something no one fully sees. What conversations are happening behind closed doors? What strategies are being discussed when the cameras are off? What does it feel like to stand at the intersection of two completely different worlds, one built on exposing truth, the other built on managing it? That tension? It doesn't disappear. It builds. And whether it ever becomes visible is something no one can predict. Because here's the truth no one wants to say directly. Not every news gets an ending. Some stay exactly like this. Unresolved, undefined, suspended in a space where facts exist but clarity doesn't. And in that space, power operates differently. It doesn't defend itself loudly. It doesn't react dramatically. It simply holds position. Until attention fades. Until questions slow down. Until the news becomes just another piece of background noise. But this one, it hasn't faded. Not completely. Because there's something about it that doesn't sit right. Something incomplete. Something that feels like it paused instead of ended. And that feeling, that's what keeps it alive. Because people don't chase answers when everything is clear. They chase them when something doesn't make sense. When the silence feels intentional. When the gaps feel too precise to be accidental. And right now, that's exactly where this news exists. Not proven. Not dismissed. Just present. Waiting. And maybe, eventually something will shift. A document surfaces. A statement gets released. A detail connects that didn't before. Or maybe nothing happens at all. Maybe it stays exactly like this. A news without an ending. A question without an answer. A silence that never fully breaks. And if that's the case, then the real news was never about what happened. It was about what didn't, what wasn't said, what wasn't pursued, what wasn't finished. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in a news isn't the truth that comes out. It's the truth that never gets the chance to. And now the question isn't just what happened. It's what are we not being told? Because stories like this don't just disappear. They don't just slow down and fade into nothing. They sit there, quietly, waiting for the moment when someone looks a little closer, asks one more question, connects one more. So what do you think? Was this really just a routine investigation that led nowhere? Or did it get too close to something, or someone it wasn't supposed to touch? Because let's be honest, in a world built on power, influence, and carefully controlled narratives, silence is never random. It's chosen. And sometimes, it's the loudest signal of all. But here's the thing. This news doesn't end here. Not unless people stop paying attention. So if you've made it this far, you're already seeing what most people miss. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts below. No filters. What's your theory? What do you think really happened behind the scenes? And if you want more stories like this, the ones that don't just tell you what's happening but make you question why it's happening, then make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the next news, it might not be louder, it might be quieter, and those are always the ones you need to watch the closest. For years, Savannah Guthrie was the one asking the hard questions. Politicians? Cornered. CEOs?
Exposed.
Powerful figures? Uncomfortable. But here's the twist no one saw coming. What happens when the person who demands the truth suddenly becomes surrounded by silence? Because right now, something feels off. Not loud, not explosive, just wrong. An investigation that was quietly building momentum, documents collected, names connected, timelines mapped, and then, out of nowhere, it just stopped. No warning, no explanation, no conclusion, just silence. And buried inside that silence, a name starts circulating. Not trending, not confirmed, but impossible to ignore. Michael Feldman, a man who was never supposed to be the news. A strategist, a fixer, someone who operates behind closed doors. Where influence isn't seen, it's felt. So now the question isn't what happened, it's why did it suddenly stop? Was there nothing there? Or did something get too close to people who were never meant to be questioned? Because when power protects itself, the truth doesn't disappear. It gets buried. The moment a news stops making noise is usually the moment it starts getting dangerous. Because loud scandals? They burn fast. They trend. They fade. But this one didn't explode. It slowed down. And that's exactly what makes it different. Because in a city like Washington, D.C., nothing important just slows down without a reason.